name's Emily, your home buying broker here at MFB. We're here to talk about the mortgage journey for our self-employed clients today. Well, essentially it shouldn't be harder to get a mortgage when you're self-employed. However, you do have to be aware at the outset that there are going to be income that's going to be looked at for the last 2 years, usually as standard. So it is essential when looking at, if you are self-employed, at looking at buying a property or remortgaging, that you do speak to your accountant or have access to HMRC self-assessment website so you can get those documents that are going to be needed for the application process in a good time. It does depend on what kind of self-employed client you are. So depending on whether it's sole trader, limited company, contractor, partnership even. But as a standard, you're usually looking at the last 2 years SA 302s, tax, which are also known as tax calculations, your last 2 years tax overviews, last 2 years accounts, and also your last 3 months business bank statements. And usually you just have to be within, the latest document needs to be within 18 months dated. As a standard, it's usually 2 years, but it does depend on the lender. So if you've been self-employed for a year, it doesn't mean to say that you won't be able to get a mortgage. It's just a case of there might be not as many options available, but that's what we're here to do and try and source an option that's going to suit your needs. No, not as standard. You shouldn't have to provide a bigger deposit if you're self-employed. However, you might find that if you've not got the last 2 years worth of income history, that you might not be able to borrow as much as what you're needing, especially if you've just been self-employed for a year. Quite a lot of lenders will look at taking account that annual income and spreading it over the 2 years to give a figure for the year's income. So you might need to put more deposit down if that's the case. Usually standard, the dividends is taken into account, so an average of the last 2 years dividends. Not a lot of sort of mainstream lenders now will not take into account retained profits, but it doesn't mean that you can't use them. It's essential that if you feel like you're going to need to use retained profits based on what you're looking to do, that you do speak to a broker initially at the outset, so we can source a lender that's going to be able to take those into account. If there's a downward trend, so if a lender's looking at the last 2 years and there is a downward trend in income, usually they will look to take into account the most latest recent income that you've received annually, and that if that's the downward trend, then they would take the lowest figure. If there's an upward trend, it's usually an average of the last 2 years. However, if there's been an instance where you've had you've been self-employed for many years and it's a one-off occasion that you've had this lower figure for the year, and there's a reason behind that, then that's something that we can speak to a lender about and see whether we can use an average. It depends on many factors, but it should really, if everything runs smoothly, it should be 6 to 8 weeks to completion. But that is, there's many factors that come into play with that, so it's taking into account valuations of the property. If a lender does require any sort of further documentation once the application is submitted. Also, it could be solicitors, or if you're in a chain, so if you purchase the property and there's a chain involved, then it can take longer. So you do need to make sure that you have got access to, especially if you're sole trader, that you've got access to HMRC self-assessment documentation. So that would be your last 2 years SA 302s, your tax overviews, and the last 2 years accounts, or SA 100s, which are also known as your tax returns. And also if you've got a business banking, that you've got the last 3 months bank statements. It's slightly different sometimes with dependent on what kind of self-employment that you've got. For limited companies, the requirements may be different, but that is why you need to speak to a broker initially at the outset, so we can advise on what you would need to get. So when you're self-employed, it is essential that you do use a broker when doing your application. Reason being is that we can source the best lender that's going to suit your needs. So the lowest rate is not always going to be a best rate for a self-employed person, and the best lender. It could be that you come around to doing applications and that they're not always going to be able to accept the kind of income that you want to use. And also we can ensure that before we submit anything, that we've got all the correct documentation and that we've been through the affordability calculations beforehand. Also, we manage the application right through to completion for you in terms of liaising with the solicitors, ensuring we're keeping in contact, so the whole process is very smooth. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to get in touch, please use the details below.